What is happening with gender identity politics in times of lockdown?
There's been quite a bit actually happening here in Australia during lockdown. So in August last year, a submission was made to the RACP, which is the Royal Australian College of Physicians, and the Federal Health Minister, Mr. Greg Hunt, requesting a formal parliamentary inquiry, or national inquiry, into the rapid rise of childhood gender dysphoria and the lack of scientific basis for current medical treatment. It wasn't only signed by Australian medical experts, but also by overseas medical professionals. So the concern on this is very real. Unfortunately, the Health Minister announced during lockdown that he rejected this request. And while he didn't make it immediately apparent why he reached that decision, it is actually the states and territories that are responsible for their children's hospital gender clinics. Also, he has, publicly urged state and territory health ministers to, and I quote from the Australian newspaper here, make sure controversial transgender treatments in their children's hospitals are consistently high standard and involve counselling, safeguards, and long-term tracking of outcomes. So, in response to this decision, one of the signatories of the request, Professor of Paediatrics, Dr. John Whitehall, quite rightly observed that if state governments haven't raised any concerns before, and they haven't, then they're certainly not going to raise any now. To think that our health minister is a right-wing conservative liberal, just goes to show you can't always put on politics. But anyhow, given that all health ministers in this country have been furiously busy of late, I think our approach on this matter needs to be carefully considered before broaching it again. So following on from that is what has been happening over at Australia's leading authority on medically transitioning children through the affirmative model, and that's the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. Of course, the clinic was most pleased at the Health Minister's decision to reject the national inquiry, and perhaps because they've been busy lobbying the state's mental health commissioner to allow surgery on teenage girls under 17, as well as guarantee long-term funding increases that will survive beyond the state's current pro-transgender Labor government. So now that the Federal Health Minister has rejected the national inquiry and effectively handballed the issue to all states and territories, this is just my opinion, by the way, it's highly likely that the Royal Children's Hospital will secure long-term funding and get the go-ahead to perform chest reconstructive surgery on underage girls. We'll see. All right, so as we all know, one of the major concerns around gender identity is the ideology that is being taught at public and private schools. In Australia, it's called the Respectful Relationships Education Program, which for the most part is not too bad. But of course, with all things gender identity, the sexuality content goes too far. And this didn't go unnoticed by some carers and parents who were teaching their children from home during the lockdown. So a Queensland grandmother clocked what she regarded, quite rightly, as inappropriate advice on sexting as part of her grandchild's online gender studies homework. And also a young lad from a high school in New South Wales is quite distressed at the content of his gender studies homework, especially because it contained the ill-fated genderbread person, which the Education Department had promised parents back in 2017, I think, that it would be banned. Yet there it was. So if it wasn't for kids, or if it weren't for kids being schooled at home, the pandemic during lockdown, it would have easily been missed. So yesterday, results of a survey showed 88% of Liberal Conservative supporters and 72% of Labor left believe that parents should have a right to know what is being taught and be given the choice to remove their children from those classes. anyway, if anyone is interested in that article, let me know and I'll be happy to share. So I saved the best for last. So Victoria's Births, Deaths and Marriages Registration Amendment Bill, self-ID, was passed last year in State Parliament and officially came into effect on the 1st of May during lockdown this year. By the following night, so that was a Friday, so by the following night, the Saturday night on the 2nd of May, a former footy player, that's AFL by the way, a former footy player and coach was behind bars. He was arrested on alleged stalking charges, dressed as a woman and allegedly with methamphetamine stashed in his bra. He has since been released on bail and must remain confined to a rehab clinic in Geelong for the next month before returning to court for a progress report. There's more to that story, domestic violence is involved, etc. But what I found interesting is that his lawyer said in court, he's not a bad man, he needs help and he's prepared to accept this help. You know, most people would take that as being misgendering, I certainly don't. But anyway, so the Births, Deaths and Marriages Registrar in Victoria received 50 applications to change record of sex within the first fortnight of the law being acted. So 27 of those are changing male to female and 14 female to male and 9 to change to another sex descriptor.
I just want to say something about the political situation in Norway because it's the Conservatives that are the government now, but the ones who is like pushing this trans activist politics, it's like we have a gay health minister, we also from the Conservatives, and we have a lesbian woman in the Labour Party who is, and these two are really pushing this agenda. In every political party there is an LGBT group, so they are like working together with the queer organizations to push the agenda. But what's happening now under the lockdown, it's like the government through the Ministry of Justice and Public Security has presented to Parliament a reform on the laws governing hate crime and discrimination. The reform has been under development since 2015, and the changes they are proposing is to remove homosexuality as a protected characteristic from the paragraphs on hate crime and to replace this with sexual orientation. They say the reason for this is to enable the inclusion of bisexuality, but whilst the term sexual orientation certainly includes bisexuality, it also does not exclude any orientation. One of the reasons this change in definition needs to be problematized is that the Association for Gender and Sexual Inclusivity are lobbying to include fetishes and sexual preferences in the laws governing governing discrimination and hate crime, and has succeeded in convincing several political youth organizations to bring it in proposals to Parliament. And this is, they are using this IGLIO lobby manual, as I guess you all know about. The reform also proposes to include gender identity as a protected characteristics and to remove sex altogether. The argument for this is that the laws should protect marginalized or minority groups, and since sex is a universal characteristics and a woman in particular cannot be defined as a minority, the inclusion of sex as a characteristic would result in too much police work and be ambitious as to when a crime committed against a woman is committed on the basis of sex. So in addition, the Department of Education has released a reform to the laws governing right to education, where they are proposing to remove the laws explicating parents' rights to organize and collaborate with schools. The reform also proposes that children are more involved in the formulation of laws. This sounds like a cute way to engage kids, in democracy, but in light of the several continued attempts at giving children autonomy, which is also mirrored in the activism related to gender identity, this reform is potentially very serious. Considering that a lot of young people consider it a good idea to remove the myth of biological sex from sex education, giving young people more say in the development of law seems very risky.
Obviously, in this time of lockdown, every political initiative has frozen, apart from some webinars, also from gender identity politics. But while for us radical feminists, this time offers the opportunity for a reflection on a world in which women, their bodies, their gaze, and their policies put themselves at the center of world. We are talking about a change of civilization, and there are various initiatives in this direction. For the politics of gender identity, the pandemic constitutes an abrupt stop because it has abruptly brought us back to the truth of bodies, to their fragility, to their limits, to a biology that cannot be cancelled. As you know, this virus affects differently men and women, and so for many other illnesses, as you know, for a complex set of reasons. If your body is male, you can define yourself as a woman, but the virus will behave with you as it does with men. Your intentional gender isn't important. I believe this constitutes a big check for gender identity policies, but I also believe that depends a lot on us radical feminists to take the opportunity to build a new world in which transsexuality and gender identity lose center stage and return to be a marginal phenomenon from a qualitative and a quantitative point of view. Transsexuality must stop pretending to be the paradigma in Italiano of the human being. It is a big challenge for us.
Like at a social, political level is just starting, and right now, during the pandemic, it's mostly concentrated on social media and like feminist groups, because as a country we're dealing with the corrupt government and the really bad handling of the pandemic. But in this respect, it's very much like high school bullying at this point, especially the last few weeks. Rat femmes have been harassed online and bullied and exposed, especially this week in Twitter, and then it went from Twitter to Instagram, posting screenshots of things they've said, or like even videos, their names, where they went or go to university. And it's been happening a lot lately because I guess people have more time in their hands, so they don't have anything else to do. So that's what's been happening mainly, because most of the feminist movement here is, of course, liberal, and as they call themselves, intersectional feminists or trans feminists, or lesbo feminists, when they are really not lesbo feminists. They just are lesbians who are feminists, and they don't seem to know the difference. There are like important figures who are also in favor of this. There's particularly a woman who's from the national football team. She describes herself as a lesbian feminist, and she has been tweeting about like TERFs and how, you know, how we're very harmful to people and stuff like that. So it's basically just that people, women from my group organization, which is Radical Feminist in Santiago, which is the capital of Chile, Fresa in Spanish. They have been targets of this. I think even like people that are not explicitly radical feminists, like maybe are radical friendly. There was one girl who was harassed and bullied, and she tried to kill herself, and she's currently in a psychiatric institution. So they really don't seem to know what they're really doing to women, even to minors. So it's really, really harmful and ugly. And even to me, sometimes I get overwhelmed because it's like, I know this is a global thing, but now I feel like it's getting a little bit out of hand because of the lockdown.
I'm not aware of anything happening special during the lockdown on that topic, only through the social media. We've seen quite a lot of trans people complaining because they couldn't go on with their treatment or they had to stop it, but nothing much than that.
Yeah, just picking up on what you were saying there, Marie-Josèphe. Yeah, there's been some of that here as well, but I think like one of the things that certainly, you know, in the first, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 weeks of lockdown, although it's a terrible situation, one of the things actually that was really good about it was that it all seemed to go very quiet. I mean, I don't know, you know, because obviously the news, everything is just all about a coronavirus, and you know, I'm sure it's the same, you know, for a lot of us in our different countries. And it was, I just found it quite merciful, sort of, that they all shut up. But there has been some of that nonsense as well about their treatment. And again, I think if the scales haven't fallen from anyone's eyes yet, just the sheer absolute pathological narcissism of that, when you've got cancer patients being denied treatment or postponed treatment, and just the general sort of, you know, terrible suffering that is, you know, happening to so many people at the moment, just like, you know, horrors. I think it's really showed it up as being this kind of, you know, like first world problems that is, you know, in terms of like where it's come from, and the sheer, as I say, kind of narcissistic, entitled nature of the whole phenomenon, I think is really shown up. And obviously, I think maybe Marina was talking about this as well, you know, in terms of bodies, you know, there's been quite a lot, you know, in the reports about the percentages of men who are succumbing to the virus, you know, in terms of contracting it and deaths, and the percentages of women. And you know, you haven't heard anything in any of these reports about, oh, if you identify as non-binary, you won't be a man or a woman, so therefore you'll never die from it, because where are all these miraculous non-binary people who are not going to die from coronavirus because they're neither male nor female? So in fact, while we've been doing all this lobbying and campaigning, you know, just the sheer reality of it being, you know, coming in such a powerful way into everyone's living room, you know, on a, you know, not just a daily basis, but several times a day, I think has kind of, you know, if it hasn't already, it will really make people see it for the nonsense that it is. In terms of some of the specific developments, I can't remember if this had already happened. I know Lynn Hahn was on the, you know, featured a couple of weeks ago, so maybe it had already happened, but the Crown Prosecution Service, who had issued guidelines to schools in this country about, they were called something like bullying and hate crime guidelines, something like that. But obviously they gave, because they were very pro-transgender, they actually sanctioned the bullying and, you know, hate crime against girls in schools, because they said that schools could be threatened with legal action if they didn't allow men to use women, you know, male teachers to use women's toilets, or boys to use girls' toilets, etc., under this whole guise of transgenderism. So anyway, there was a legal challenge mounted to that, that was fronted by an anonymous 14-year-old girl who very courageously took this on, and the Crown Prosecution Service have now dropped those guidelines. So that is a really important victory, and I really applaud everyone who was involved in that. A couple of other things. We've just heard that Stonewall, which is the main, you know, LGBT, or well, yeah, definitely the main one, in some ways the only one of its kind, the LGBT organisation in this country, has now, GBT I should say, they have now appointed a new chief executive who, from everything we can see at the moment, is definitely going to be waving the trans flag. So that seems to be kind of business as usual happening there. And there was also maybe I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks ago now, there was Lesbian Visibility Week as well, which is on the whole, it's one of these things that is that got set up by, I think it's the editor of not the editor, the owner of Diva magazine, which is supposedly a lesbian magazine, but it's very, very pro-trans. And it's been taken up by Stonewall, and so it's, you know, in lots of ways it's quite awful. They had you know, like these various lists of great lesbians that included these terrible men, you know, really awful men on them who pretend to be lesbians. But at the same time, there was quite a lot of presence, from what I could see in social media, of those of us who obviously don't entertain any of that nonsense, and there was quite a lot of lesbian feminist visibility. So I think that was quite a good thing. But the main thing, as far as I can see under lockdown, is that the whole situation has exposed the sheer nonsense of it. So so that's something.